I am Father Gabriel. For more than 2 decades, my life revolved around the priesthood. From the time I was a young man, I felt a deep calling, a conviction that my purpose was to serve God and offer guidance to those who sought comfort and meaning in their faith. My days followed a disciplined rhythm, structured by prayers, masses, and spiritual counseling. I had come to know the people of my parish intimately, their struggles, their dreams, their silent pleas for divine intervention. It gave me a profound sense of fulfillment to be their shepherd, leading them toward the light of Christ. No matter the hardships or personal sacrifices, my heart remained at peace, assured that I was exactly where I was meant to be. But nothing in all my years of devotion had prepared me for what was to come. That day began like any other, ordinary in every way. The early morning air carried a crisp stillness as I entered the sacristy, readying myself for the upcoming Mass. The lingering scent of incense hung in the air, a quiet reminder of the countless prayers that had been uttered within those sacred walls. Golden rays of sunlight filtered through the stained glass windows, casting colorful patterns onto the floor. I lifted my stole, inhaled deeply, and closed my eyes for a brief moment, asking the Lord to guide my words and actions for the day ahead. But then, something unexpected happened. A sudden, unfamiliar pressure gripped my chest, as though an unseen force was pressing down upon me. At first, I dismissed it, attributing it to exhaustion or perhaps the effects of an early morning chill. Yet, the discomfort did not fade, it intensified. Each breath became more labored, each movement heavier. My hands trembled involuntarily. A creeping coldness spread through my limbs, and an unshakable weakness took hold. The world around me blurred, the familiar warmth of the church replaced by encroaching darkness. I tried to steady myself against the sacristy table, but my strength drained rapidly. My cassock felt constricting, as if suffocating me. Sweat trickled down my face, though my fingertips remained icy. I wanted to call out, to seek help, but my voice failed me. As my vision dimmed, I found myself staring at my own hands, hands that had so often held the chalice, blessed the faithful, and lifted prayers to heaven. Now, they lay useless, trembling, unable to hold onto the life slipping away from me. Then, at precisely 4:37 p.m. on October 15, 1998, everything went black. But that was not the end. In truth, it was only the beginning. The first thing I noticed was the complete absence of pain. The crushing weight vanished, replaced by an inexplicable lightness. No longer did I feel the floor beneath my feet, nor the tightness in my chest. When I opened my eyes, I was no longer in the sacristy. I was no longer anywhere that words could describe. There were no walls, no ceiling, no clear horizon. It was a realm without limits, beyond the constraints of time and space. Yet, despite its strangeness, there was no fear. Instead, an overwhelming sense of peace filled me, a serenity so profound that it nearly erased the memory of what had come before. But I was not alone. Though at first I could not see anyone, I sensed a presence, an embrace of warmth that surrounded me. I had no physical form, yet I existed. No sounds were spoken, yet understanding flowed effortlessly. Then, out of the infinite stillness, light began to take shape. It was unlike any earthly light, neither harsh like the sun nor flickering like candle flames. It was something greater, alive, radiating love and wisdom in its purest form. I felt an irresistible pull toward its center, not out of compulsion, but of an innate longing to be closer. And then, he appeared. At first, he was but a silhouette within the radiance, but as the light softened, I knew with certainty that this was no mere vision. I was standing before Christ. Not the static depictions I had known from paintings and sculptures, but a presence so vast, so incomprehensible, that it transcended any earthly image. His gaze was powerful yet tender, his very being exuding love so boundless that it was nearly overwhelming. But amidst that love, there was something else, something I did not expect. He looked upon me in silence, and at that moment, I understood that words were unnecessary. It was as if my very soul lay bare before him, every thought, every deed, every prayer I had ever spoken now transparent in his presence. Then, in an instant, my awareness expanded beyond myself. I was granted a glimpse, not just of my life, but of humanity as a whole. What I saw shook me to my core. People were lost, wandering further from the truth. Pride, doubt, and an insatiable thirst for fleeting pleasures had blinded them. Faith was being abandoned in favor of meaningless distractions. So many no longer sought God's wisdom but instead turned inward, believing they needed nothing beyond themselves. And in that revelation, I understood the sorrow in Christ's eyes. It was not anger nor condemnation, but grief deeper than words, like that of a loving father watching his children drift away, knowing they had chosen their path, yet still longing for their return. If you are not subscribed, I recommend subscribing and activating the notification bell so you don't miss any videos. I felt a weight in my chest, but it wasn't the kind of weight that comes from physical pain. No, this was something far greater, something that pressed on my soul, pulling me deeper into a reality I had never before comprehended. It was in that very instant that I understood something profound. I wasn't merely there to witness, to observe, or to simply be. I was there to know, to carry the truth of that moment with me, to let it live in me, to let it shape everything that came after. The sheer magnitude of that realization struck me with a force beyond words, a force that swept away all the certainties I had once held about my faith, leaving me standing before something so vast, so immeasurable, that my previous understanding of the world seemed insignificant in comparison. I had always believed in Christ and had always spoken of his love, spreading his message to anyone who would listen. But in his presence, at that moment, I realized the depth of my ignorance. My understanding was painfully limited. There was so much more to him, so much more to his love, to his sacrifice, than I could have ever fathomed. Eternity wasn't some abstract concept, something far off in the future or some distant dimension. No, eternity was alive, vibrant, and pulsing with a kind of energy that could not be ignored. It was a reality that was just as present as the air I was breathing. Souls weren't just numbers in a church pew, they weren't just nameless faces. They were sparks of the divine, each one carrying with it a purpose, a choice, a story. And yet, so many were lost. So many were caught in the fleeting illusions of this world, voluntarily turning their backs on the very source of life itself. My heart tightened with a sorrow I had never known before. It was as if I could feel the weight of every lost soul, every missed opportunity for salvation. I wanted to ask, to speak, to shout out for those who were wandering in the darkness. But before I could form a single word, Jesus raised his hand, not as a command, but as a gesture of understanding. It wasn't a gesture of authority. It was a touch of compassion, of love that transcended everything. And in that moment, everything shifted. A wave of vision washed over me, and suddenly I could see faces. So many faces. Some I recognized, others were strangers. I saw people praying, some with fervor, with genuine faith, while others prayed out of habit, their hearts distant from the words on their lips. And then some had forgotten, who no longer even remembered God. I saw a world rushing by, a world obsessed with empty conquests, with an unquenchable thirst for things that could never satisfy the deepest longings of the soul. Yet, in the midst of it all, I saw those who still searched, those who were still seeking, still yearning for something greater, even if they didn't know exactly where to look. And it was at that moment that everything clicked. It all made sense. Christ hadn't brought me there to frighten me or to leave me trembling in fear of what was to come. No, he brought me there to understand. To understand the vastness of his love, the urgency of the mission, the weight of the responsibility that now rested on my shoulders. He called me so that I could return, so that I could speak, so that I could plant seeds in the hearts of those who were still open, willing to listen. But how could I do that? How could I convey something so immense, so indescribable, to a world that seemed determined to close its ears and blind its eyes to the truth? My chest swelled with doubts and questions, but Jesus just continued to look at me, and in his gaze, there was an unwavering certainty, a certainty that transcended everything I had ever known. I had to try. I couldn't try. I had no choice. The vision began to fade as if the light was slowly being absorbed by something greater, something beyond my comprehension. But even as it dimmed, something remained within me, something so clear, so vivid, that nothing could ever erase it. There were no more doubts, no more questions. I knew what had to be done. And yet, as much as I knew, I also felt a deep fear in my heart. Was the world ready to listen? Were the people ready to see? For so many years, I had preached God's word, and I had seen the resistance, the skepticism, and the indifference with which so many treated faith. Before, I had thought of it as just a pastoral challenge. But now, in the light of what I had witnessed, it seemed so much more urgent, so much more serious. Time was running out. The message echoed in my soul, reverberating with an intensity that left no room for doubt. Time was not infinite. Humanity's chance to awaken was slipping away, and far too few seemed to realize it. As that thought sank deep into my being, I felt the shift. The lightness I had once felt was fading, and something was pulling me back. A force, invisible but undeniable, was pulling me away from that sacred place, pulling me back into the physical world. I didn't want to leave, not because I doubted what I had seen, but because I feared that once I returned, all of this would become nothing more than a fading memory. I feared that, over time, it would lose its sharpness, its urgency. I couldn't afford to forget. I couldn't forget. The transition was harsh. One moment, I was before Christ, immersed in an unshakable truth, and the next, I was ripped away. A shock pierced my chest, a deafening sound filled my ears, and coldness swept over me. Pain, sharp and all-consuming, tore through my body as if I had been ripped from a place of perfect peace and thrown back into a world of suffering. My lungs filled with air in desperate gasps, and my vision was overwhelmed by the harsh, flickering lights above me. Voices were shouting, commands were being barked, and machines were beeping with a rhythm I couldn't quite understand. I was in a hospital. My heart, which had stopped just moments before, was now beating again, rapid and forced, driven by the wires and needles that now connected me to this fragile, broken body. Hands were pressing against my pulse, checking my vital signs. I was alive, but different. The nurse muttered something about a miracle, but at that moment, I knew. I knew it wasn't a fluke. It wasn't just science or luck. I had returned, not by chance, but because I had to. I was sent back for a reason, and now, I had a mission. If you are still watching this video and find these lessons useful, please comment 1 below to let me know that you are still here with me. And now, I had to figure out how to fulfill what had been entrusted to me. The weight of that responsibility pressed down on me more than any physical pain ever could. My body was still weak, bound by the limits of recovery, but my soul burned with an intensity one had never known. While doctors spoke of rest, tests, and follow-ups, my mind was elsewhere, racing through every moment of that encounter, every word unspoken yet deeply understood, every look that had pierced through me like fire. The pain I felt upon returning wasn't just the agony of a body that had been jolted back to life. It was the staggering realization that my mission on earth was far from over. In the sterile silence of my hospital room, I had time to reflect. Time to absorb what had happened, to make sense of why I had been sent back. God had given me a second chance, but not so I could simply continue as I had before. Something inside me had irrevocably changed. The faith I had always carried now burned with an urgency I couldn't ignore. I saw everything differently. The words I had once preached now carried a weight I had never truly grasped before. But with that clarity came a question that gnawed at my soul. How could I possibly convey this to others? How could I explain something so vast, so beyond human language? And most of all, would anyone listen? Those questions haunted me, circling in my mind like an unrelenting storm. The day of my discharge was surreal. The world outside the hospital seemed unchanged, yet I was no longer the same. People hurried about their lives, caught up in their routines, lost in the trivial worries of the day. They were unaware, utterly oblivious to the truth I now carried inside me. I watched them, and for the first time, I saw them as he did. Some still had light within them, a flickering ember of faith that had not yet gone out. But so many were empty, wandering through life distracted, numbed, unaware of how fleeting time truly was. I wanted to reach out, to shake them from their slumber, to tell them what I had seen, what I now knew with absolute certainty. But how? That question echoed through my soul until the moment I stood before my congregation once more. It was a familiar place, a familiar act, delivering a sermon, speaking of Christ's love. And yet, everything had changed. As I looked out at the faces before me, I saw them differently. I didn't just see a group of believers gathered for Sunday service. I saw souls standing at the edge of eternity, some still holding on, others teetering, unaware of the abyss before them. My hands trembled as I took a breath. Not from fear, but from the sheer weight of what I was about to say. And so, I spoke. I told them everything. Not in the sterile, detached way of someone recounting a dream, but with the raw, trembling voice of a man who had stood on the threshold of forever and had been sent back to warn the living. I spoke of the urgency, of the sorrow I had seen in Christ's eyes as he watched humanity turn away from him. I spoke of the fleeting nature of this world, of how the time of grace was not endless, and of how so many were wasting their chance to return to him. Some listened intently, their eyes wide with understanding. Others shifted in their seats, visibly uncomfortable, as if the truth I spoke unsettled something deep within them. But what struck me most, what I will never forget, were those who came to me afterward. People who had never truly believed before. People who had been too afraid to seek confession, too unsure to reach out, too burdened by doubts. And yet, something in my words, something in the fire that now burned in my soul, had stirred something inside them. As the days passed, I began to understand the difficult truth that my message would not always be embraced. Some people looked at me with doubt, as if I had fallen prey to a delusion brought on by my illness. To them, my words were the product of a weakened mind, a result of my recovery rather than something deeper. Others, who had once regarded me as a trusted spiritual guide, began to pull away from me, avoiding conversations that once would have come naturally. The urgency in my voice seemed to unsettle them as if it were a burden they were unwilling to bear. I saw how easily people could fall back into their routines, seeking comfort in their distractions, unwilling to confront the unsettling reality of what lay ahead. They did not want to think about change, about what was coming. They longed to carry on, to ignore the truth that I now felt so profoundly. But I could no longer remain silent. Even when doubt crept in, when the resistance of the world made me question whether I should persist, I would close my eyes and remember Christ's gaze. The sadness, the silent ache for a humanity that was turning its back. It wasn't about fear or punishment. It was about love. A love so boundless that it still offered a chance, still gave us time to turn back, to see once more. That's when I began to step beyond the familiar comfort of the church walls. I had to go where the need was greatest, to reach those who would never step inside a temple. I visited places where faith seemed lost. Hospitals, prisons, the streets where despair weighed heavy on the souls of those who had nowhere else to turn. In the eyes of the forgotten, I saw something I didn't often find among the complacent faithful sitting in pews on Sunday mornings. A raw need for something greater, an unspoken hunger for purpose, even if buried under the weight of pain and hopelessness. In those places, I felt the pulse of my mission. It wasn't about preaching to the choir, it was about reaching those who were lost, who were broken, who were searching without knowing what for. I shared my experience, not as a warning or a threat, but as an invitation. Some laughed, others wept, but some listened and allowed a small seed of faith to take root in their hearts. And it was for them that I continued. One night, I will never forget, I found myself walking through the city streets after visiting a hospital. My thoughts lingered on the conversations I'd had, the pain and the hope intertwined in the eyes of the patients I'd met. The sky had darkened, and the biting wind cut through my clothes, but within me, there was a warmth that refused to fade. It was as if an unseen hand was guiding me, urging me forward. And then, I saw him. A man sitting on the sidewalk, his knees drawn to his chest, mumbling words I couldn't make out at first. His clothes were ragged, his face a map of suffering, and his eyes were those of someone who had already given up on life. I approached him slowly, uncertain of what to say when he looked up at me. "There is no hope for me anymore, Father," he whispered, his voice thick with despair. I sat down beside him, quietly, knowing this was not the time for hurried words. I listened to the brokenness in his voice and let the silence stretch between us. And then, I shared with him a piece of what I had seen, a glimpse of what I had learned in my time of suffering and renewal. I spoke of Christ's love, of the pain in his gaze, and how, even now, there was still time for change, still time to choose a different path. As I spoke, the man's tears fell, not out of sorrow, but out of something deeper, something that resembled relief. For the first time in a long while, he believed there was hope. He believed he was not beyond saving. At that moment, I realized something that would stay with me forever. My mission was never about the numbers. It wasn't about convincing everyone. It was about finding the ones who still carried a flicker of hope, however small, however faint. Every soul that turned back toward God was a victory. Every person who allowed that seed to take root was one more step toward fulfilling the purpose Christ had set before me. But that did not make the road any easier. It was harder than I had ever imagined. There were days when the weight of loneliness became almost unbearable, pressing against my chest like an unseen force. The silence around me was deafening, a cruel companion that whispered doubts into my soul. Was I truly making a difference? Did my words reach anyone, or were they merely lost in the wind, fading before they could take root in anyone's heart? I often found myself staring at the sky in the late hours of the night, watching the stars flicker like distant embers. I would pray, not always with words, but with the unspoken cries of my heart. Am I doing enough, Lord? Am I on the right path? Sometimes there was no answer, at least not in the way I wanted. No great sign from the heavens, no sudden revelation. Only the steady rhythm of my breath and the quiet conviction that I had no choice but to move forward. Christ had never promised an easy path. He never spoke of comfort or a life free from hardship. What he did promise was his presence, his unwavering companionship through every trial, every storm. And that, more than anything, was what kept me going. I could not turn back. The journey was far from over, and I knew, deep in my soul, that time was slipping away like sand through my fingers. This second chance I had been given, this renewed sense of purpose, was not something to be squandered. Every word I spoke, every act of kindness, every moment of love and compassion, no matter how small, was part of something greater than myself. Something I might never fully understand, but something undeniably real. At first, I had hoped that transformation would come swiftly, like a storm breaking the sky, shaking the earth beneath my feet. But I soon realized that the human heart does not change in an instant. It is a stubborn, unpredictable terrain, where truth often struggles to take root. I saw the apathy in people's eyes, their polite disinterest, the way their expressions would shift, sometimes with discomfort, with irritation, as if my words threatened to stir something they wished had remained dormant. And then there were those whose reactions were sharper, their faces tightening in frustration, their words clipped and dismissive. I was called a fool more times than I could count. I was told to stop speaking nonsense and to let people live their lives as they pleased. It was not easy to witness. Rejection never is. But amidst those moments of resistance, I also saw something else. Tiny sparks of hope. A flicker of curiosity in a once dismissive gaze. A troubled young soul, weary of life, hesitating before asking a question. A hardened face, etched with years of sorrow, softening, eyes brimming with unshed tears, as if, at last, a door had been left slightly ajar for something greater to enter. And I knew, of course, that not all would listen. Some hearts would remain closed, perhaps forever. But it was not my task to force belief upon anyone. I was merely a messenger, a voice carried by the wind. And for those who were ready, the words would find them. And for those who weren't, perhaps one day, long after I was gone, they would remember. One evening, an old friend, a fellow priest, came to me with concern written across his face. He had seen the fire in me since my return, the urgency in my voice, and it unsettled him. "You are pushing yourself too hard," he said, his voice heavy with something deeper than mere concern. "Perhaps you should slow down and take care of yourself." But there was something beneath his words, something unspoken. It was not just worry for my well-being, it was fear. Not fear for my health, but fear of what my urgency implied. Fear that the world was changing. Fear that time was, indeed, running out. I met his gaze and spoke the only truth I knew. "I cannot live as I once did," I told him. "I do not speak because I choose to, I speak because I must. To stay silent would be to deny what I have seen, to turn away from the truth that has been revealed to me." He did not reply at first. He simply lowered his head, exhaling a long, weary sigh. And in that moment, I understood. Even among those who serve God, there is hesitation. There is fear. Because to truly accept what is happening, to acknowledge that something greater is unfolding, demands more than faith. It demands courage. And courage, I realized, is far rarer than belief. So I pressed forward. Even when my voice trembled, even when my steps felt heavy with exhaustion, I pressed forward. Because I had seen the light, and I could not turn away. Because I had felt the weight of eternity pressing against my soul, and I could not ignore it. Because love, true, divine love, is not a quiet thing. It is not meant to be locked away in the depths of one's heart, hidden behind walls of doubt and hesitation. It is meant to be shared, to be shouted from the mountaintops, to be poured out like an offering, even when it is not understood. If you are still watching this video and find these lessons useful, please comment 2 below to let me know that you are still here with me. Months passed, and with each passing day, my message seemed to echo louder, finding its way into places I could never have anticipated. In some corners, I was met with warmth and acceptance, like a seed being sown into fertile soil. People listened, they absorbed, and their hearts were open to the words I spoke. But there were other places, darker and more resistant, where my message was met with suspicion and distrust. In those moments, it felt as though my words were nothing more than fleeting whispers lost in the wind. Yet, despite the opposition, something strange began to unfold, something I had never expected. People started to come to me, not in the open where others could see, but in secret. The faces that appeared before me were often the last ones I had expected. They were not the ones standing in the front rows, fervently listening in church, but those who, for years, had remained hidden in the shadows. Some were long-time members of the church, faithful in their attendance but silently burdened with doubts they had never dared to voice. Others were more skeptical, but something deep inside them had begun to stir, like a dormant seed awakening, questioning whether there might be something more to this life than what they had always known. I saw parents who had once felt confident in their choices but now carried the weight of broken relationships with their children. I saw young people whose eyes no longer held hope, wandering through a world that had lost its color. I saw elderly individuals, nearing the end of their days, wondering if their time for redemption had passed, if they had squandered the chances they had been given. Each conversation with them was like a mirror, reflecting what I had been shown in that place between life and death. So many were blind, their hearts hardened by the world, but still, some could see, if only someone was willing to guide them with patience and love. It was humbling, knowing that I had been chosen to be that guide, even though I was nothing more than a vessel, a humble servant. But not everything was as easy as it seemed. The more I spoke, the more I noticed a growing resistance. Some people began to accuse me of exaggerating, of speaking too much about the urgency of conversion, about the approaching end times. They said I was scaring people, creating unnecessary fear. Even within the church itself, I noticed that some of the priests who had once been my brothers in faith began to avoid my words as if the weight of my testimony was too much for them to bear. Rumors began to circulate, questions were raised, and there were even attempts to discredit my testimony. In those moments, I felt a pang of loneliness, a sharp ache in my chest. I wondered perhaps if Christ had felt the same pain, when he saw the world reject him time and again when he realized that, despite performing miracles and offering hope, many still chose not to believe. I thought about how he had faced that rejection with quiet strength, knowing that his mission was not to convince every heart, but to remain faithful to the calling he had been given. But in Namad darkness, I remembered one thing: this was not about me. I was not the one who needed to be seen, nor the one who needed to be praised. I was merely a servant, a small instrument in a far grander plan. The mission was not mine, it was his. And as long as even one soul was willing to listen, I knew I had to keep speaking. That was the reason I had returned. That was the purpose of this difficult, painful journey. One night, as I sat alone in the parish chapel, my heart heavy with prayer, I felt a weight that was different from any I had ever known. It was not doubt, fear, or even sorrow. It was a deeper, more profound understanding of what this journey meant. The answers I had been seeking were not in the number of people who came to me or in the acceptance or rejection I received. The answers lay in something far simpler, far purer, in obedience. In the quiet, unspoken act of continuing the work set before me, even when there were no guarantees, no assurances of success. My role was never to convince, never to force belief or change. It was to remain faithful, to stay true to the calling I had been given, no matter how many turned away or mocked my words. As I knelt in that silent chapel, I realized that this was the heart of my journey. Not to seek approval or recognition, but to be faithful, to trust that in every step I took, even in the smallest moments of silence, I was fulfilling a purpose far greater than I could ever fully comprehend. And perhaps, in the end, that was enough. I closed my eyes, and for a fleeting moment, I felt something so familiar, so profound, that it nearly took my breath away. It was that same indescribable peace, the one that had enveloped me the moment I left this world, a peace so pure, so overwhelming, that no words could ever do it justice. It was as if, for just 1 second, Christ himself reached out to remind me that I'm still here. You are not alone. A single tear traced a path down my cheek, but it was not born of sadness. It was gratitude, deep, unshakable gratitude. Because despite everything, despite the struggles, the doubts, the loneliness, and the rejection, he had given me a gift that few would ever receive. He had allowed me to see, to know the truth beyond the veil, and now that truth burned within me like an unquenchable fire. I would carry it with me for the rest of my days, no matter how heavy the burden, no matter how difficult the road ahead. And so, I continue. Even now, I preach, knowing full well that not everyone believes my words. I see it in their eyes, the hesitation, the skepticism, the discomfort. Some dismiss me outright, brushing off my testimony as exaggeration or fantasy. Others listen politely, yet I can tell they do not truly hear. But I have come to understand something vital. Each heart awakens in its own time. I cannot force their eyes to open, nor their souls to recognize the truth. All I can do is speak, plant the seed, and trust that one day, perhaps in a moment of desperation when all else has crumbled around them, my words will resurface in their minds. I fear, however, that for many, that moment will come too late. When the final hour arrives and there is no more time left to choose, when they look back and realize the warnings were real but ignored, that is when my words will finally make sense to them. And yet, I cannot allow despair to take root in my heart. I cannot dwell on the ones I cannot reach. Instead, I press forward, holding on to the certainty that as long as there is even a single soul still willing to listen, I must continue. Because on that day, when I stood before him in a place beyond time and space, I was given an understanding that changed me forever. Faith is not merely a feeling, a fleeting emotion that comes and goes like the wind. Faith is a choice. A deliberate, unwavering choice to live by what we know to be true, even when the world ridicules us, even when the road is steep and lonely. And I have made my choice, not because I am stronger, not because I am better, but because I was called. And by his mercy alone, I was brought back to fulfill this purpose. And so, my journey continues, just as yours does. Every step we take in life, every challenge we face, and every truth we encounter shape us into who we are meant to be. Now, I want to turn this to you. After hearing this story, what have you learned? What is one thing that resonated with you, something that you will take and apply in your own life? I would love to hear your thoughts, so please share in the comments below. Your words might inspire someone else who needs to hear them. And if you found this video meaningful, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our YouTube channel so we can continue sharing more stories that move, challenge, and inspire. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.